Hi everyone. Hope all of you are doing great. If you are able to hear us, please say hi in the chat section so that we'll know whether this stream is going great. Hi Keshav. We'll just start in a couple of minutes, just waiting for everyone to join in meanwhile. Awesome. Good to see all of you go joining in. Thank you everyone for joining in the afternoon. I'll just share a quick intro about Chris. Uh, Chris is an engineer at company, and he has been heavily helping the folks at open source. He contributes a lot, and that is why we have him here to share us the importance of open source and how we could learn ahead and learn from him. So, thank you so much, Chris, for taking out the time and joining us very early from UK to inspire us all about open source. I'll leave the stage open to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Akshay. So, hi, and welcome to my talk on the power of open source and our role in it. So, Akshay just gave you a very brief introduction there. I'll follow that up with a little bit more detail. So, as Akshay said, I'm an engineer at the company, and there we're building an open source platform that puts people in control of their data. So open source for me is something where I started off as a user and then became a contributor. And these days I play a part as an open source maintainer. And all of those ways of interacting with open source kind of continue for me on a day-by-day basis. Aside from that, I'm the co-host of the Tech Debt Burndown podcast. So along with Nick Selby, we talk about tech debt and how to deal with it. And I've been for a little while a cloud editor at InfoQ. So if you've not come across InfoQ, it's an online IT news platform. All of the people that write there are IT industry insiders who get trained to be journalists rather than journalists who are trying to figure out tech. I've been blogging now for almost 14 years, so you can see what I've been writing about there on blog.thestateofme.com, and links to my social profiles, etc. You can find them all at chris.swans.net. So anybody wanting to come back to these slides, I'll be posting them after the talk onto my SlideShare, and you can find the link to my SlideShare there. All right. Onto the agenda then. So I'm going to talk about the 3 freedoms of open source. And I'll start off with free like beer, then talk about free like speech, and then finally free like puppy. And I think when you're looking at any kind of open source project, whether you're using it or thinking about contributing to it, or thinking about taking something that you've developed and making it open source, you need to think about these 3 freedoms and getting the right mix of free like beer, free like speech, and free like puppy. I then want to talk a little bit about people of open source, some of the major figures that have driven the open source movement, what their motivations have been, why they've done that. And then that leads into really how you can get involved. And I think ultimately the entire point of this talk is to encourage more people to get involved in open source in all the different ways that it offers. So free like beer. Well, of course, beer isn't free, but when people give us a free beer, then that's very nice. And so that's why the saying free like in beer kind of comes along when we're talking about open source. And so free, everybody's favorite price is $0 or 0 rupees or £0. And that conveys to us a lot of other freedoms. If we don't have to pay for things, then all of the stuff associated with paying for things starts to go away. And that gives us a lot of freedom, and it kind of gets us out of dealing with a lot of the friction that might be involved with other types of software. So go back a little way, so-called Lintel, which was a contraction of Linux and Intel, and kind of sat alongside of Wintel, which was the contraction of Windows and Intel, ended up disrupting the proprietary Unix server market. So this is a picture of some Silicon Graphics Onyx 2 and Origin servers from around 2000. And 2000, in many ways, kind of marked the peak of the proprietary Unix server market. It was just as .com was turning into .bomb, and we had all of these .com startups that had bought huge amounts of kit in order to run their websites. And a lot of that kit was proprietary Unix kit, whether that came from Silicon Graphics or HP or Sun or any of the other companies that were around at the time. And we didn't really think about paying for operating systems. It wasn't like when you bought a Silicon Graphics box that you really thought too hard about IRIX, the operating system that came with it, being a paid for extra. It all came as a bundle, but it was kind of expensive. And so during my time in banking, I saw what was typically a large Sun estate being replaced by much cheaper Intel servers running Linux. And this was kind of a two-pronged piece. So firstly, it was a lot less expensive. And secondly, actually the performance was pretty good as well. And so that combination of open source software and it being free and a hardware platform that enabled great performance really allowed people to scale up and scale out in ways that hadn't previously been possible. And so it wasn't very long after that proprietary Unix servers and the proprietary Unixes that they ran kind of got pushed out of the picture. And so these days, when we think about Unix, we're mostly thinking about Linux or maybe FreeBSD or OpenBSD and the various other open source flavors of operating system out there. So $0. You don't need a purchase order for $0. And that means that if you're trying to do something that would normally need a purchase order and all of the bureaucracy and time taken and convincing bosses and everything else that goes along with that, you don't have to deal with that when it's $0. And if I go back to the sort of early to mid noughts, there was a bit of a theme at the time of CIOs at big banks and other large enterprises being asked, are you running Linux in your organization? And many of them at that point would shake their heads and kind of go, no, we're a Windows shop or we're a Sun shop or whatever it happened to be. And of course, the reality was they just didn't know, because their engineers were all running Linux on PCs under their desks and stuff like that, and just getting on with it. And they were able to just get on with it because they didn't have to get permission to spend money. And I think that led into then open source and especially Linux enabling the cloud. It's hard to imagine that things like Amazon's EC2 would have been able to come along and grow to the size that they've grown if the cloud service providers were having to pay for things like operating systems and databases and middleware and all of that stuff from the proprietary software world. And so as we've been through the transition into using cloud services and everything that's enabled over the past years, it's important to kind of see that open source has been a key enabler of that. And the open source free as in beer has been a significant factor there. So you don't need permission from your boss. to spend $0. And that empowers individuals and teams to get on and build stuff, to make their own choices about the software that they're going to use, and to take the friction out of the work that they're doing. And I think another piece to this is do try this at home. A lot of engineers will have some kind of home lab or some experimentation that they do in their free time. And in the past, a barrier to that has been getting hold of licenses for the software that they're using at work. But when you're using open source at work, then you can try things out at home without any concern about having to spend money on software licenses. And I think that is, again, a powerful feature of free as in beer for the open source world. So moving on now to free like speech. And here's a photo of somebody speaking at Speaker's Corner. So Speaker's Corner is a place in Hyde Park in London where traditionally people can show up and make speeches, and other people might come along and listen to what they've got to say, especially if it's interesting. This photo is particularly interesting for me because it comes from Cory Doctorow, who's been a big campaigner around open and the rights associated with open. So he's licensed this using a Creative Commons license. Creative Commons is something that Cory helped establish. And so this is licensing as associated with cultural artifacts like photos and talks and videos and that kind of thing. But it's very closely associated to the software open source movement. So it's important to understand that open source software comes with not just rights, but also sometimes with obligations. So here's just the top few rows of the Wikipedia article that is a comparison of free and open source software licenses. And what you can see here is that there are many different licenses. We've only got the A's and the top of the B's here. And that each of those licenses is presenting different qualities in terms of what you're allowed to do with them. And so you can see here, there's kind of green coloring for permissive. Blue is highlighting a thing called copyleft, which I'll explain in just a moment. Yellow is showing up that things may have some restrictions. And red is illustrating where the license doesn't address that particular aspect. And so, the columns are looking at things like linking, distribution, modification, whether there's patents included, as well as issues around copyright, whether private use is facilitated by those licenses, whether sub-licensing is allowed, and whether there's any trademark grants associated with it. So between copyright, patents, and trademarks, it's covering really all three key areas of intellectual property law. So copyleft is an important aspect here, and I think worth taking a moment to explain. So all of this is premised upon copyright, and I'll go to that a bit more in a moment. And so copyright is where somebody's creating something, the law is permitting them some exclusive rights over that. And what has happened with open source is the notion of copyleft. The idea that if somebody is taking an open source creation and making changes or improvements to it, that those changes and improvements should be made available as broadly as the original piece of open source. So this is an obligation that's carried along with the open source license. and comes with things like the GPL, the General Public License. Some describe this as viral licensing because it's placing obligations on the people that get involved with it. But it can also be a very good thing because it means that improvements to the open source aren't confined to just being used by the people that made the improvements. They're contributed back into the broader community. So we have copyright and we have copyleft. So two symbols here. Copyright are the frameworks that are in law, and there's a lot of kind of international trade agreements have leveled copyright across domestic law, and organizations like the World Trade Organization behind that. There's also the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, and their symbol is shown here as well. And I'll just talk for a moment about OSI approved licenses. So this is taken from the OSI website, and these are listed as their popular licenses. These are ones that I think you'll see very typically with the open source software that you'll encounter. And there are so-called liberal licenses like the Apache license and the BSD 3-clause license, which basically allow people to use the software licensed under those in pretty much all the ways that they'd like to. And then there are licenses like the GPL, which has this copyleft arrangement within it, which brings with it obligations. But in some ways, those obligations create an environment where people that are improving open source with that obligation to contribute it back means that everybody's benefiting from those improvements. Whereas what can happen with liberal licenses is people take open source and then go off into their own little corner and do their stuff with it, but the rest of the community doesn't get to see that improvement. So we get to the third and final freedom of open source, and this is maybe the less good freedom, free like puppy. And there's a picture of my dachshund Max when he was a little puppy. So puppies take a lot of time and energy and care and feeding, and software can need care and feeding as well. Software generally brings with it bugs, and bugs bring with them the need to be fixed, especially where the bugs introduce security vulnerabilities. And so for anybody using open source software, there's a need to think about who's going to take care of it. And for individuals or organizations, they might start out thinking, well, the community will take care of it for me, or I can just fix things myself. But in many cases, people figure out that it's actually better to pay somebody else to take care of the open source software that they're using. And this is really what's given rise to companies that are based upon open source. And I think most famously, Red Hat, now part of IBM, made a business out of supporting the Red Hat Enterprise Linux and those kinds of distributions, so that people would know that there was somebody there taking care of Linux for them, so that they didn't have to. Puppies have the problem of making messes that need cleaning up, and I think that's also the case with software. Software has mess that needs cleaning up, and the first thing that comes to mind here are security vulnerabilities. I expect many people watching this might have been impacted at the end of last year with the Log4j issues, and so hugely popular open source logging framework used all over the place. And when we think about complex software installations, there was very often something in the stack that was using Log4j. And then along came a vulnerability where if people could craft a message that would find its way into the logs, that would then potentially attack the machine that the logs were being run on. And so, that's a mess, and that needed some clearing up. And this can happen with proprietary software as well. But whether it's proprietary or open source, the software is behaving a bit like a puppy, and it's so necessary to think about who's going to take care of the cleaning up that's associated with it. So when you're looking at open source software, ask yourself, how much puppy? Because if there's too much puppy, then it might be worth evaluating something else that could potentially address the problem in a similar but different way. Okay, so changing gear a little, I wanted to talk about some of the people of open source. I think it's important to kind of see who have been the foundational people of the open source movement, and what were they thinking, what were they trying to accomplish. So I'll start with Richard Stillman. Richard nowadays has become quite a controversial figure for some of the views that he's expressed and some of the behaviors he's exhibited. But Richard was able to see into the future and see that software was going to become part of everything that everyday people did in their daily lives. And we now see software as part of our cars, software as part of our TVs, software in our hands, in our phones. And RMS, as he's often known, kind of conceived of a world where all of this software was under the control of corporations, and felt that that wouldn't be a world that he particularly wanted to live in. And as a result of that, he sort of instigated the Free Software Foundation and created the GNU project, which is still very much a huge part of a lot of the open source that we use on an everyday basis. In order to really create a counterculture to everything being under corporate control. So as you can probably see from his photo, RMS is a bit of a bearded hippie type of guy. And I think he kind of took those maybe 60s hippie ideals about freedom and thought about how they could be applied to software. And that's had a huge impact on the world, because the Free Software Foundation and the GNU projects have been included in so many different things. And that also gave birth to the general public license, which is that copyleft license I was referring to earlier on. Then there's Eric Raymond. Eric as well is a somewhat controversial figure these days, again, for some of the things that he's said in public. And Eric is most famous for authoring The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was a seminal book about open source, published over 20 years ago now, but in which he kind of observed the differences between the Cathedral, which was the organizations building proprietary software and how they organized themselves, and the Bazaar, which was this kind of loose collective of people collaborating across the internet in order to build open source software. And I think what we've seen subsequently was the Bazaar moved inside of the Cathedral, and we saw huge organizations like Microsoft have adopted open source software and adopted the methodologies that people use to create open source software within their organizations. Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux. Linus also occasionally gets himself into trouble for stuff that he says, but not in the same way as RMS and Eric. So he's occasionally rude to people in the Linux mailing lists. Normally when folk aren't kind of coming up to the standards that he expects from contributors to the kernel. As well as creating Linux, he also created Git. And I think in the full course of time, that might turn out to be the more important thing to the open source community and people using software in general. But these are two hugely impactful projects. So somebody perhaps less famous than Linus, but somebody who's been certainly influential to my own journey through the world of open source is Sarahdrazner. And I bring up Sarah now as an example of a kind of more typical leading open source contributor and maintainer. So I first came across Sarah when she was giving a talk at a serverless conference. And she was showing how to use the Vue front-end framework, which she's been a contributor to. And as well as creating parts of that software, she's also created tutorials for Vue and maintains the Vue snippets in VS Code and lots of sort of ancillary stuff around Vue. But she's a very frequent conference speaker, very visible in the community, and always very helpful in kind of getting people started on their journeys. And so it's important to have folk like Sarah engage with communities. It's not just about the code, and Sarah writes some great code, but it's also about helping people understand what the code can do, bringing people in, and just facilitating adoption of good stuff. And along similar lines, Kelsey Hightower is a great guy. He's created things like Kubernetes the hard way, which is on his GitHub as a way of explaining to people how all of the grisly details of Kubernetes fit together. And the hard way is a methodology that's all about sort of rubbing people's faces in the details, so that it's not magical. It can all be properly understood. So Kelsey's been a huge proponent of the open source projects that he's been involved in. I first became aware of Kelsey when he was at CoreOS. He subsequently moved to Google, where he spent a lot of time engaging with Kubernetes as a project that's come out of Google. And people just love Kelsey's presentations, where he'll get up on stage and kind of live hack his way through an example of how to do something, which makes it really relatable, and people can kind of go, yeah, okay, I can follow along with what he's showing me there, and that means that that's something that maybe I can get involved in myself. I only came across Brian about a week ago, but Brian Fox has been a prolific contributor to many super important open source projects, most notably Bash. I use the Bash shell in my Windows subsystem for Linux and on my Raspberry Pis and on just about everything else I touch pretty much every day that I'm doing work. And so, it was great to find out about the man behind the code. And I think another example of, top open source contributor. But the reality is, open source can be everybody. It can be anybody, and it can be you. And if we look at popular open source projects like Certbot, I can see that that's got 443 contributors at the time that I looked at it, which is an interesting number because that's the port for HTTPS, which of course is what's enabled by the Certbot engine that lets people get free certificates from Let's Encrypt. So talking about how you can get involved. In my last job, I used to say to folk, if you find something, fix something. And what I meant by that was, if you find a problem with a project, then fix it. And very often that doesn't mean you even need to be able to code. A lot of the problems are with documentation. The people that write stuff really struggle sometimes to understand getting back into the seat of the people that are going to come along and use it. And so if you find bugs in documentation, you can do people a favor that are coming along behind you by fixing the README or something like that. Be considerate of upstream maintainers. So any decent project is going to have a contributing guide. So take a look at that. And many projects as well nowadays have a code of conduct, and it's important to understand and follow that, which is basically just don't be rude and annoying to the other people that are participating in the project generally. These are the rules of engagement that we have at the @company for when we're looking at upstream projects and making changes to it. So we start by raising an issue to the upstream repo, and that's kind of hey maintainer, I've found something that might be wrong, and the best outcome here is it gets fixed by somebody else. But if that doesn't happen, then we can submit a pull request with the desired change and hope that the maintainer sees that and is able to merge it upstream. And it's only when that doesn't happen that it's really okay to then think, okay, we've got to fork this repo and publish a variant. And occasionally open source projects get abandoned, and if they're being used, it's sometimes useful for somebody else to come along and fork it and keep on maintaining it. There's some great learning resources out there. My personal favorite is this learning path on Microsoft Learn, build community-driven software projects on GitHub. And that is a very hands-on thing. So it actually uses GitHub to teach you about GitHub and kind of runs through everything involved in building an open source project and building community around an open source project. And then there's things like Hacktoberfest. I was really pleased to take part in Hacktoberfest last year. And at company, we found a bunch of our repos and made them part of Hacktoberfest, which meant that people came along and grabbed hold of the tagged issues and helped us build our software. So I'm looking forward to doing that again later this year. And I was really chuffed when my T-shirt showed up a couple of weeks ago. And right now, we've got the @company mobile app challenge going on. So that's taking the Arrive app that we've open sourced and asking people if they can contribute ways that they can see to improve that. And so there's challenges like this happening all of the time on a wide variety of projects. Okay, so we're pretty much at the end. So a quick review of what I've talked about. The 3 freedoms of open source. Free like beer. When stuff is $0, it gives you all kinds of freedom. Free like speech. Open source is viewed as a type of speech. And that brings with it rights, but it also brings with it potentially obligations. And then finally, free like puppy. Open source needs to be looked after, and open source can make some messes in your environment. And so you've got to think about who's going to take care of that. I've talked a bit about the people of open source and how the open source community is one that is very diverse and can be very welcoming, but just make sure to be sympathetic to the needs of maintainers. A lot of people in the community aren't being paid to do this stuff and aren't necessarily going to jump in and fix your problem. And then finally, how you can become one of the people of open source. And so there's lots of opportunities out there, and there's lots of great resources to help people get started. So I hope you have the opportunity to get interested and get involved. Thanks very much for watching along and listening. If you want to contact me, I'm Chris at @sign.com, or you can find me on Twitter at @cpswan. You can get started with the app platform at @sign.dev or our GitHub organization or @sign company. And I'm now ready for any questions. So actually, I hope you're going to help moderate.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Chris, for the wonderful session. I hope all of you guys loved it. I personally loved this session. Uh, that brought me a lot of insights into open source. Uh, and we've got like very few much people sharing about the reviews about the session. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking out time. So, if people who are all listening to the session, please feel free to share your questions. We'll bring questions one by one, and then Chris would help you guys with sharing his insights.
I'm trying to think back to what was the first open source thing I contributed to. But I guess when I got started programming,
Mm-hmm.
it was really before the internet was available to regular people, and so when I first saw programs, they were printed in magazines, and that's how software was distributed. You'd go to the newsstand and buy a magazine, and then go back and type a program in, and normally it would be full of mistakes because of typos, and that's kind of how I learned to program, and how a lot of people at that time were learning to program, was just debugging stuff that they were typing in from magazines. But the sort of level up then was sending stuff into magazines, and maybe getting your own programs published, whether they were kind of little games or utilities or things like that. I think the first project, sort of proper open source, that I got a contribution accepted into was Docker, and that was actually a docs fix.
Right.
So this is why I encourage people to make any kind of contribution. It doesn't have to be code, because everybody that's trying to get started needs to understand what the thing's doing, and how to get it installed, and how to get it configured from the docs.
Right.
And that can be a struggle, and I think, especially with smaller open source projects, I see a lot of times where people are using a particular framework on whether it's Node or Ruby or whatever else, and it all sort of works on their laptop, because of course they've got not just the framework installed, but they've got all of the libraries that they need to use have already been there, and the bit of code that's on GitHub or whatever, it just works for them. But the reality is there's lots of stuff hasn't been written down of you've got to get the right version of Node or Ruby, and then you've got to get the right gems or npm packages or whatever else in place before the code is going to work. And
Right.
so if you're coming along and using one of these things and kind of going, oh, I'm tearing my hair out getting all of the right dependencies installed, then doing a pull request to the README to say, hi, love what you're doing here, but can you just tell people that they've got to install the Rails gem in order to make this work, or whatever it might happen to be, is kind of super helpful to the next person coming along, who might otherwise just kind of go, I downloaded this and I tried to run it, and it's just giving me a screen full of error messages, and it doesn't work, so it must be garbage, and I'll go and try and find something else, because there's
So,
so much stuff like that. Yeah.
I have this question: like, how important is it to for open source projects to have good documentation?
Super important. And it's not just documentation, it's kind of being clear about sort of everything to do with the project. And actually GitHub have got a really good tool called Community Insights, and some of the work I've been doing at the At Company is making sure every project that we make public is ticking all of the boxes on Community Insights. So Community Insights is asking is there a README? Is there a contributing guide? Is there a code of conduct? Is there a license? Are there templates for people to raise issues and pull requests? Does the organization accept security notifications? So it's kind of taking you through a checklist, and all of those things are important. So if I just pick one of them, license, it's kind of the number of open source, or in air quotes, open source projects that folk come across where there's no license. And it's sort of, if there's no license, then it's just a piece of software that's been published on GitHub. But
Definitely.
by law, there's no rights conveyed with that. The copyright is still being held by the person that wrote that software. And if they've not added a license to it, then for sure they've published it, but they've not said that you can use it. And so, that should be seen as a warning sign.
Right.
And then, using open source inside of companies, there's quite a lot of fear of the copyleft licenses. So, I know in the organizations I've worked in the past, the lawyers there very much favored the permissive licenses. So, we would have these kind of green lists or whatever of software that we were allowed to use. And it was dead easy to get something onto that list if it had a permissive license. And it was more of a challenge to get things onto that list if it had a copyleft license. And I think the concern there was, it was okay if we were just using GPL stuff, but if we were modifying it, then how were we going to satisfy the obligations that came there with copyleft? And what sort of mechanics would be needed to make sure of that? And there have actually been cases of companies being sued for distributing stuff that's been based on the GPL and not publishing the changes that they've made to that. And a lot of that has actually happened in Germany. I think to an extent here, people kind of go shopping for the the right courts and the right jurisdictions to deal with these issues. So there's huge considerations around licensing that need to be taken into account there. And what we've done is we've created what we call the archetype repo as a template in GitHub. And so in our archetype, we have the README, we have the contributing guidelines, we have the standard code of conduct, we have the templates. Templates now we do at an organization level. And so what that means is it's really easy to get started with that. And actually, this reminds me, we've been talking about open sourcing the archetype because there's no reason why that shouldn't be used by other organizations to help them be the basis of their open source projects.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. So let's move to the next question. So we have a question from Shreya asking, what role does GSOC help hold in open source contributions?
So GSOC being, that's not a familiar...
Google Summer of Code.
Google Summer of Code. Yeah, so Google Summer of Code is an initiative that's been run by Google now for many, many years. And I think it's another one of those things that kind of stands alongside of Hacktoberfest as an initiative that is encouraging people to get involved in coding, and as part of encouraging people to get involved in coding, encouraging people to make contributions to open source projects. Google have been involved in open sourcing a great deal of their own work over the years.
Right.
Every day, the stuff we're doing at the App Company, we're building things on the Dart language and using the Flutter front end framework, which of course out of Google, and they're BSD3 licensed, so very permissively licensed as open source. But then you can look at things like containers.
Yes.
And the core components of containers with C groups, kernel capabilities, and namespaces were all contributions to the Linux kernel that came from Google. And
Right.
then along came other folk later to make the userland tools to make that stuff accessible. Most notably Docker. And then that spurns another round of innovation, because we saw Google turning son of Borg as Kubernetes. So they'd taken what happened inside of Google to build software and made that something that pretty much everybody can make use of now. But of course, they're not purely kind of benefiting the community with that. That's also something that helps grow Google Cloud. So Google Summer of Code, I think is one of those initiatives that really helps people get into coding in general, but open source as a part of that. And so it's a good initiative, I think.
Right. Uh, Thank you so much. So just move on to the question. So we have from Anthony. So, are there any implied patent licenses under GPL and other open source licenses?
So part of the table that I referred to earlier was kind of talking about whether licenses dealt with patents or indeed trademarks. So you've got this kind of trifecta of intellectual property with copyrights, patents, and trademarks. And it's the usual for open source licenses to just deal with copyright and to not actually come with patent grants or with any kind of trademark grants. So
Right.
it's quite unusual for them to deal with patents and trademarks. But there are examples of licenses that do deal with patents and even with trademarks. And so if there's particular concerns around patents, then look for the licenses that deal with those. And sometimes, again, when we're thinking about rights and obligations, using certain licenses brings with it an obligation to contribute the patents associated with software, or at least to kind of sign up to only using those patents defensively in order
Right.
to protect the open source software that's associated with it.
Got it. Got it. And so I'll just take a last question. So, how do we generate revenue from open source? Is that something that people contributing to open source should actually think about getting revenue?
So there's a lot of people kind of talk about open source business models, and open source in itself is not a business model. But people have built businesses around open source. I think the businesses that have been most successful at exploiting open source are actually the hyperscaler clouds. But I wouldn't say to somebody, it's a good idea to go into competition with Amazon and Azure and Google, because they involve billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure. I already talked a little about Red Hat. I think Red Hat became almost the kind of signature commercial open source organization, and the first company that was making billions from open source. But in many ways, the Red Hat model was kind of taking a traditional licensing model and just applying it to open source software. And I don't know if you could start another Red Hat today. And so there's
Right.
still lots of questions to be answered around how to monetize open source.
Right.
But I think in general, build services on top of your open source that are valuable to people and charge for the services seems to be the way that the world is going.
Agree with you. But do you think that a lot of open source projects so come up just to like generate revenue but have not been successful because they come up with a different initiative, but at the end if the motive is to generate revenue, it would not make sense, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
So we've seen a sort of rash of companies that basically thought they could follow Red Hat in charging for support, where their open source has subsequently been used as the basis of a cloud service, and they felt that all of the revenues being stolen by Amazon or whatever. And in some cases, they've even kind of changed the licensing model going forward to prevent companies like Amazon from using it. And that's and again, in some cases, led to Amazon just kind of going, okay, we'll fork the project. And so you've then kind of got the original open source creators going off in one direction, trying to get money out of support, and the Amazon fork going in a slightly different direction, and in many cases being seen as the more free open source side of the project. And so is Amazon the bad guy there for making a service out of it and making some money, or are they the good guy for keeping it open and keeping a live community around it and for their own contributions? And there's a lot of debate about that.
Right.
But what it says is, I think you can't now just take a bunch of VC money and throw a project out into the world as open source and then expect to be able to monetize that from support. You've got to think more carefully about how services are going to be built around it.
True. Definitely agree with you. So, um, I guess the way you explained it right was brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Chris, on that. And I guess we have come to the end of the session. Uh, so would like to thank you, Chris, for sharing, because open source is a very big topic, right? And summarizing that in a short session and helping us through your thoughts, that was really great. Thank you so much for that. And so for all of those who are viewing the session, we have shared a link to the next session. Kindly join that as well. So uh, thank you so much all for joining this.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Chris, for taking out time and then helping us with your knowledge. Thank you so much.
Bye now.